$28.29 in fees, which left us a balance of $705.97. All of the accounts total we have at the end of February, we ended with $20,797.46.
Any questions, comments, additions? Mike? Motion approved for Mike Helding, second for Mark Levy. All those in favor? Passes. Editor, Chuck?
I would like to report at this point. How many of you received an email from me on Monday? Yeah. How many of you don't know?
This is the garden, by the way.
What's your spam? It'll be coming from editor at MissouriAquariumSociety.com. It was a review of a lot of things coming up, as Pat mentioned. I am looking for articles, photographs, one ads, committee reports, whatever for the next starter. So if you have got a high point fish and you want to write about it, or even a low point fish and you want to write about it, that's fine too. Photographs of your fish tanks, things like that, send them to the editor and try to have them to me by May 10th. Everything after that will go into the next starter, which will not come out until July. So.
The articles will be anything about raising fish, keeping the tank up, cleaning a tank, anything you want.
Yep. It's one of the major reasons, or ways we get information out amongst the other folks in the hobby. Actually, our darter goes to 40 other clubs across the country, and even one in Australia. And we also borrow articles from theirs on occasion. So if you write something and it goes in the darter, trust me, it's going to be seen a long way away. So, thanks a lot.
Auction, Mike?
We're having an auction coming up May 1st. We've got,
When will the numbers go out, the buyer numbers, or the bidder numbers, the seller numbers?
selling numbers? Now. There's only a few spaces left.
Well, like I said, and I know Randy sent his in too, I did not receive a number back yet.
Actually, some of you guys, that have been contacting me saying you haven't been getting it. For some reason, the, auction at Missouri Aquarium Society is showing up spam on, some of your, emails, so look at the spam.
Okay, we'll just, that's what mine was.
Well, I entered mine all the time. I get so many.
Send me an email. If you didn't do it, send me an email again, and I will send it to you from a different server, and, do it that way. I need some people to stick around after the swap, for about a half an hour to an hour, so that we can change the room over from swap to auction. So we'll be doing that about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, on Saturday, the 30th. And, other than that, we'll need you, as usual, we'll need all our volunteers, our sellers, and especially need our buyers. Because the buyers are ready. We've got just about all the seller numbers taken. There are a few left. So one of them.
Man here. Work man here.
All right, thanks, man.
All right, thank you.
Send me too.
Mike,
B&B, Mike?
just talking.
Our Steve?
Black ones?
No.
You're all right?
The guy that's helping me treat my work infection.
Oh, Charles is there.
B&B is a where's the word program.
Third row back on the end cap. So that's why the glasses.
Dang, I thought that was him. It's different.
Julie Cross turned in, Peter Pumpkin Lionside, one of the endangered Indians. Mike Hubert turned in a Nolanterra species. Ethel 1A, Conde Peacock. He turned in Leucochromis rhodesii, Papachromis Statocalepia nuclea, Hemicranus rummy-nosed tetra, Iliodon whitei, one of the Judeans, Placebochromis species, genital reef, Pinochromis point salmon, Synchrochromis Luca formulatus, and then Holly and Kevin turned in Amicus splendens, Xenotoca Doroi, Xenotoca lion's eye, Bob Watson turned in a Montcolenia dicrophossiata, convex cichlid, turned in Amicus splendens, Genencia concoct, that's very rare, light rare, for Ripley's Meat Guy, Carmel. Spofford's domestic maculatus, blue platy. And Mitchell Wendell turned in Silly Ely.
Any questions for me, VAP Chairman? Thank you, Steve. HAP, Mike?
All right. HAP tonight we had quite a few submissions. There will be some nice photos of some of these blooms online, or on the, or in the next article, I should say. Brian Woodrick turned in Ely Java Fern. He also turned in the octopus plant. Red Canna turned in Julie Cross. Julie Cross turned in Red Canna, her paperwork for the bloom. And then she turned in Richie Fluidams, and she also turned in water lettuce. And Holly Kevin turned in Bucephalandra, Green Amanda, and there are going to be a few more of those tonight. Bucephalandra names that are just made up, so we'll see how many we've got here. Justin turned in, Justin Wardock turned in Lanzanandra and the Bulleye Red. The Trident Mini Java Fern. Rotella Indica Dwarf Rotella. Hypercotyle Japan. Dwarf Sagittaria. Water Spangles. Ludwigia Atlantis, which I'm sure he just made up that name. The Myrophilum Guiana. Didipus Guiana, which is another one that's been kind of popular the last couple of years. Red Root Floater. Bucephalandra Sky Blue, which looks green to me. Bucephalandra Godzilla. He also turned in Red Root Floater. And Blixa japonica. Also Roundleaf Modernia.
You were busy.
Yaoi
Half of them are full.
Colorado, which is Rotala. And then we also turned in variegated moneyway. And those are featured with blooms, all of those are equal blooms. So he joined our HAP tonight. He was real active in Seattle HAP, but now he's getting active in ours. So welcome, Justin.
Thank you.
Woo, good. Left side, Charles, have anything to say on the left?
No, not anything in particular, I should be up to date.
Okay. We are still in need for a new editor. Chuck is going to retire from that position, but we need somebody to take over his spot. And you can talk to Chuck about how to do it. He'll help you get started with these. Was there any other report that I didn't talk about? Stephan Tanner is our speaker for tonight, and he is the editor and owner of Amazonas Magazine, and Swiss Tropical. He goes to a lot of the conventions and stuff. I should say all of them, pretty much. And he supports the hobby very much, so donating products and magazines and clubs. And wait, he made, I don't know, something for sale or what?
I brought a few things, but we can talk about that afterwards.
Well, thank you, Stephan drove all the way down from Minnesota. Or you gotta say that funny way, don't we? Minnesota or
Yes, something like that. I'm not native about it. I'm an invasive species. Well,
Me
good
too,
evening,
me
everybody.
too. I'm in
I see a lot of familiar faces, which is a good thing, because we always lose a few every year. Does this work? Yes. it was working. So, Stephan and kindly invited me to come down here. I think I was here twice last year, once for the AKA, once for the ACA. But it's always fun to see good people again, and the fish hobby is just good people. That's the way it should be. So as Pat already mentioned, I have two different hats, other than trying to take care of my 7.5-year-old. But I own Swiss Tropicals for, I think, since '06, since I founded it. And me and my partner Matt Peterson, we purchased Amazonas magazine now, it's close to 4 years ago. It would have folded because the publisher at that time decided that he wanted to make his life easier and concentrate on Coral magazine and get rid of Amazonas. So we decided to pump a bunch of my money into it to keep it alive. But we can report that after 4 years, we're making money, about $2,000 a year. Which means a lot of people actually get paid. The printers, the designers, they all have salaries. Nobody works for free except me. And but I don't, fortunately, I don't need the money. Swiss Tropicals does provide the cash. But I brought a few special issues here. I brought some books. I think Bruce just got one of the Banjo Cat books written by Stephan, a good friend in England, and published by another friend in Germany. So we're always trying to publish stuff that is unusual, that people are not necessarily willing to. I mean, no big publisher is going to publish a book where you have a freight run of 500 books, because trust me, you're not going to get rich publishing niche of great books. But let's dive into the topic. I think Stephen asked about, see if this works. Oh, this one. So I'm just briefly going to talk about Amazonas magazine, because this weirdo person here is Hans Evers. I know Hans since the early 1990s. When I took a train to Hamburg and met him, and we have been friends ever since. He's actually the founding editor of the German Amazonas magazine. And he is like totally on drugs when it comes to fish. He always has a huge fish room. He just loves fish to no end. And that's somewhere in Indonesia, at one of the big breeders' place where the picture was taken. But he started in '05. In 2012, it was acquired as an English license copy by Reef the Rainforest. And we have continued the licensing agreement with the German publisher ever since. And meanwhile, we're bigger than the German publisher. So it's kind of fun. So we try to really cover all kinds of things. The way we publish the magazine is we make so-called theme issues rather than sort of a whole preliminary issue. So one, we focused on native species here in North America. And that was a very popular issue in Europe and Asia. I mean, they flew off the shelf. And then, because I'm by training a cancer geneticist, this was always very much a topic I wanted to write about, man-made fishes. And Hans, for example, he hates anything man-made to no end. He absolutely loves white colored fish. So, but I said, we need to talk about it. If we don't talk about what we then call the good, the bad, and the ugly in my editorial, then there's a lot of misconceptions out there what man-made fishes are. I mean, for a lot of people in here, it may not be any news, but any platy or swordtail is a hybrid in the trade. None of these red life bearers are pure species. These are all crossed between a block and a swordtail, because that's the only way they're red color. So, but just sort of as an idea, if you're interested in the topic, we really try to cover what does man-made fishes mean on the various aspects. What we really put a lot of emphasis on is pictures and somewhat more advanced information. We also want to show all kinds of tricks. I mean, the whole idea is you grab your magazine, you go to the bathroom, you sit down, you enjoy a stinking important meeting for 15 minutes, and then you come out and you want to go into your fish room. That's the kind of thing when you read an article. I always say to authors, well, what should I write? It's like, well, something where the person after reading feels like, I want to keep that fish, or I want to do that. This is what really makes the difference between just babbling along or really having an impact.
Stephan, one thing I did not mention about is the collecting trip tomorrow and Saturday, if we have enough people to go. But whoever goes, they do need a fishing license to catch fish, by the way.
Right, I still need to purchase one anyway, so. But yes, tomorrow, whoever wants to come along, I don't know exactly who is going to come along Friday. I know Stephen and I and Gary and who else?
Where you go?
Jack. Well, don't ask me. I'm just.
If you'd like to go Saturday, come see me. Happy to talk.
But tomorrow there's also the option to go to the places. I know that Stephen cannot make it tomorrow. But we also can just do half a day. We don't need to go, you know. I know Jack mentioned that it would be good to be a few people, so that in case one of us falls in, then there's at least 2 or 3 to drag us back out. So that's always helpful. Anyway, this is an issue. I have lots of back issues. If you're interested, every single back issue back to 2012 is still available. Now the very first one, this one here, gets down to double digits numbers in storage. Usually print a few hundred extras, but this one is starting to get a little scarce. One thing we tried 2 years ago, I think, is we started to promote the Weird Waters idea, the cartoon, and it's now streaming. I have no idea at this point how successful it is. The idea is essentially it's something to get kids interested in fish, and the reception by test audiences was very good. I don't know exactly, it's now streaming, I think, for 3-4 months maybe.
My 6-year-old really likes it.
Right. I mean, I've showed it to my daughter, and she is totally. These little stories about fish. Now you can argue that. I mean, this is supposed to be a cardinal. That you can kind of guess is a tiger bar. That is a betta. You can sort of figure out that this is supposed to be a corridora, so it's kind of a stretch. But you can now always ask Jerry, he knows a lot about Cory, so. But if you show me that fish, that would be the first group of fish coming to my mind if you ask me what that is. But then, you know, as long as kids get involved in the hobby, goal is achieved. So before I go into the whole pleco thing, I would like to bring up something that has happened in the last 2 years. Brazilian fishes used to be omnipresent, everywhere. Not just after zebra plecos and other things came on the market, even before. Neon tetras, cardinal, neon are mostly from Peru, but cardinals, ruby noses, coming out of the Rio Negro region, and many corridoras used to be the essentially staple of most imports. And you had four major areas around Manaus. North of it, here's the Rio Negro, where all these tetras come from. You have the area around Leticia. Here, lots of fish also go to Colombia or to Iquitos from there. You have the Belém region, where all these shingle plecos and lower Amazon tributary fish come from. Lots of the fancy plecos are out of this area here. And then, way in the past, that is 30 years ago, there was still exports happening out of the Rio de Janeiro region. And these fish used to be present and then completely disappeared because most exporters shut down out there. But in 2000, Brazil did what currently our government tries to do. They did drastic export limits. Now, what we're talking about here in the US is the import restrictions. But the result is pretty much the same. The first so-called white list, which is what that piece of legislation currently in Congress talks about, in Brazil allowed 450 species, and then they updated it in 2012 to 750 species. It still destroyed over 95% of the whole trade. Most collectors went back to other incomes, gold washing, logging, and drug planting. Because, conservation, as the saying goes, there are no hungry conservationists. Because if you're hungry, you're going to do whatever it takes to survive. So, Brazil, we kind of talked about that, it's not relevant here, collapsed. But in 2020, pretty exactly 2 years ago, they changed the law and they went back to the blacklist. Also because it was almost impossible to enforce. Identifying 750 species positively each time is tricky. If you can say, oh, these are 50 species that are red listed, if you have those in the box, we're going to put you in jail. That's much easier to achieve. So they actually went back to a red list, and the whole thing, this is now a year-old slide, started to ease up. These are 3 species. They used to be very prevalent, and then this one was always legal, but these 2 were illegal to export, and they're now coming in again. And if you look on Brazilian import lists or vendors who have Brazilian fish, they can get you these again. The current red list only affects about a dozen trade species. Jack and I talked last year and just tonight again about all Brazilian killifish are red listed. So any Brazilian killifish endemic in Brazil, there's some that are, for example, occurring in Paraguay and Brazil. They may be red listed in Brazil, you can still keep them because they also occur in Paraguay or in Uruguay. But others are illegal. The zebra pleco is still illegal. And by the definition of the Lacey Act, which is an act Roosevelt signed in 1900, essentially means that if a species is protected in another country, the US has the means to prosecute you for trading it here in the US. Zebra plecos were never, ever legally exported because they were never on a white list. And they're since 2004 red listed. De facto, the zebra plecos that anybody has, including me, are illegal fish. Now, so far, nobody has knocked on my door, but it's the same problem as with the killifish. even if you have killifish that you acquired 3 years ago, because they were never legally exported, that doesn't make them legal even if you had them before you got to know. And it's like the tax law, it doesn't matter if you didn't know. If they catch you with it, it's still illegal. The cool thing is, ever since they changed the rules and focused on the fish that are really endangered, we get a plethora of new fish. So this is an area here that has been fished extensively now. And the sort of sad thing is, in this whole area here, access there is mostly because the vast majority of landscape is soy fields now. So if you take a picture from above, it looks like the Midwest. It's literally roads and soy fields and a little bit of drainage ponds. But one of my friends and authors of the Brazilian Tetra Special, he is regularly there. He's a Tetra specialist. And he says the odd thing is the fish still occur despite drastic changes to the environment. Now, of course, nobody knows, for those that are occurring in little streams only, if the next time they try to fuel up a soy harvester and the diesel truck tips over into the creek, then that might be the end of it. That's the problem with species that are only in very restricted areas. But there's cool fish there. Do people know what this is? Yep, flame or red Rio tetras. They actually come from right here. But the fish that currently get exported from out of this area, they were transplanted years ago. And Flavio told me that if you go in the Rio Tiete, it's like there is just millions of red Rio tetra. The odd thing is, they are regularly on the list. I have some wild ones at home that I got from Steve Lundblad from the wet spot, because I told him get some if you can get some, because they're cool fish. And they're on the red list in Brazil, but they're openly exported. But where they come from originally is literally a little creek that is now in the middle of Rio de Janeiro. And that's why they're red listed. In their original habitat, they may only occur in very few specimens. That explains why they're red listed. But because somebody let them go in a nearby stream, they actually occur by millions. So, aside from the fact, I mean, there's, I don't know, half a dozen different breeding forms, albinos and pink ones and apricot and whatever, longfin ones and so on. There's probably more red of Rio tetras produced in Asia every year than were ever living in the wild.
It used to be pretty common in pet shops.
Well, it's still common. It gets sold literally by millions. You can go in almost every PetSmart Petco and you'll find flame tetras. Not the wild form, but some of the mutants. So that's where they come from apparently. But there's a really cool fish among those tetras. This is a new Thieria species. These are Iphisobricon red cherries. That's how they look when they're in sad conditions, and that's how they turn when they're cool. This is a close relative of the red of Rio, White's Manorum. You want to learn more about that? That's in the special. These are cool fish. I have all three species at home. I have the other ones before as well. This is Aru, coming from slightly north. This is Coriolis, and this is Montagi, Iphisobricon montagi. You can read about this right here. All right, let's switch to the other dog. start at the beginning. All right. This talk goes back way over 20 years, and it was the root was the long discussion that my friends and I had in Germany about why do we kill so many blackos? Because in the early 90s, when all these fancy blackos came in, we did not know anything about how they live, what they eat, what they need, and we killed millions of blackos in the by feeding them their own food or keeping them at their own temperature. And so it became sort of a calling of like, let's try to figure out how to keep these things alive and almost how can we breed them. And of course, after those restrictions in Brazil became effective, everything was put on the table trying to breed them, because suddenly most of the fish that used to come in box loads disappeared from the trade. And I used to be working in the pet trade in Europe, and we used to buy in Germany, zebra blackos, a good 3-inch in size adult wild fish for 8 German marks, which at that point was probably like $14 or $15 wholesale. And we could sell this for $30 in the store. Wow, this big. If you get wild ones today, they're only about yay big, because over-collecting has severely replenished the areas, and despite the fact that there are several breeds, especially in Jakarta, they produce thousands of zebra blackos every month, thousands. But they mostly go to China, because China pays more for the fish, and of course Japan is still one of the biggest buyers. And the transport distances to China is of course much shorter than to the US. On top of that, now you have Fish and Wildlife intercepting zebra blackos when they come in, even if they're tankers. Now you can get them in under CITES permits, which is that agreement about the trade of endangered species. But most wholesalers don't want to do that because it's extra work. So, I don't think we need to go in all those details. Everybody knows what food is. It's essentially energy, building blocks, and stuff to make this machine here working. And that's true for fish too. So I'm not going to go into this here. So, the interesting thing about pet food is it's almost more highly regulated than the stuff we buy for ourselves. And in the good old federalist fashion of America, we don't have like one rule how you could possibly do things. No, we have 50. Because that's much more efficient. So, this is the organization. Now, this is not an organization with any sort of executive or legislative or judicative power. It's essentially an organization of state regulators that come together to try to more or less agree to the same thing. The goal is uniform laws, etc. It's not quite so easy, because I know from my friend Alan Rinpoche started to launch fish foods that in some states they simply go into a store, pick up a bunch of foods, and then check if you're licensed in the state. And de facto, a food manufacturer has to license the fish food in every single state. So for a company with like 40 SKUs, like Rinpoche, that's $250,000 every year. Just trying to get all the regulations in place, which essentially, for the most part, screws the little guys, the little companies. Because, of course, the people who stand behind regulating this tend to be the bigger ones. And how do you most easily, have no competition is you make the hurdles to get into the business so high that if somebody starts up, the expenses are very high. And the rules vary. In some states, you can just buy, pay a single fee, $1,000 or so, and you are licensed as a company and whatever you want to sell. As long as it, it's not something, harmful or so. In others, it's like, up to this much, it's so many dollars per SKU, and then it's a tonnage fee on top of that. So if you sell more than 10 tons, then it's like another 15 cents per pound. So it's very complicated. But that's how they rule that. Now you can argue the idea behind it is not that bad, because some of you probably remember the whole scare maybe 10 years ago with the melamine in cat and dog food, plastic essentially, that was included because it looked the same as protein when you run it through the analysis systems. So the basic idea to make sure you're not selling crap is a good idea. And this regulatory body says you have to put the ingredients in order of how much you put in. Then there's a whole bunch of requirements. These are the detailed requirements. So the brand, what it's for, how much, what's the guaranteed analysis, the ingredients. It has to, for example, say, is it a kitten food, or is it food for adult cats, or is it a complete diet and not just a supplement? It should include feeding directions, and you absolutely have to have this on there. So who are you and where do you make it? Then these things here need to be included. Essentially, the breakdown what you have on every sort of food label, even for human consumption. Then, if somebody really wants to knock themselves out, this link leads to 1,500 pages of regulations. Some are circular in argument, so if you read something, it's like, well, that doesn't quite work. If I do this, it doesn't work. So it's kind of funny. But in recent years, the food industry has started to develop new technology. And there's nothing worse for regulatory agencies than progress, because suddenly they have to catch up and actually work. And we have to have, of course, in human food too. Prebiotics and probiotics. The simple difference is this is alive, and this is essentially something that promotes the existence of microorganisms. For example, our gut is full of stuff that helps us break down food, and if that is disturbed, say if you consume antibiotics or some fancy drugs, then that might damage it. And some of this can help. And probiotics, anybody who eats yogurt eats probiotics. The only problem is these things are not really a food, nor are they a drug. And the regulatory agency has no definition. Even in humans, food supplements are not regulated. So somebody can go and mow down the side of the highway and pulverize the stuff they harvest and put in a bottle and sell it as a food supplement. There's nothing that prevents them from doing that, because there's no rule. So as long as you call something a supplement, you can evade lots of rules. Prebiotics, this is actually a really cool ingredient that Sarah uses quite a lot. Comes from the cell wall of yeast, and what it does, it seems to bind Vibrio. Vibrio is a very common aquatic not parasite, but a cotton pathogen, that's the right name. And the way this seems to work is that it literally cloggers up the docking site of Vibrio, so Vibrio cannot infect itself. Pretty cool thing. Probiotics is, for example, Bacillus is now available as a food additive. So it's added in various new fish foods. How this will turn out in the future remains to be seen, but the industry spends a heck of a lot of money trying to figure out what they potentially could add. Because of course it's a constant race. If one company puts out one new product and the others catch up. I mean, see insect meal in fish food. Ripashi was the first one to start with black soldier fly larvae, and then Hagen came up with bug bites. And this all goes back to me, Emmanuel from Hagen, and Alan Ripashi sitting in the steakhouse in San Diego and discussing the application of black soldier fly meal in Ripashi's gel food. Well, less than a year later, Hagen came out with bug bites. So, yes, that's the idea from. Anyway, coming back to black rose, what does the whole food thing has to do with the black rose and the survival? Black rose are not uniform. I mean, there's over 2,000 species, probably 2,600 species now described. And they fall into vastly different categories what they do in nature in terms of feeding. You have carnivores, so obviously protein eaters. They are broadly in two major categories. One are insectivores, for the most part, so they mostly insect larvae. Then you have molluscivores, which go after snails and mussels. You have the omnivores, which are opportunistic in that they kind of eat a little bit of everything. So they eat algae or aufwuchs, but also meaty stuff or little crustaceans. What we usually think about when we talk plecos are grazers, and I will get to that in a moment. And then the fourth group are the plant eaters, and that's a very special group. I'll get to it. So let's go into what the different types of plecos include. Now, whiptails, for example, I always love that. You go into a PetSmart, Petco, or some other, maybe not so well educated store, and they'll happily sell you a whiptail as an algae cleaner, except those things never touch algae. Doesn't matter how big or small they are. They're pure carnivores, and that applies for the guys that just live on rocks or wood, but also applies to all the sand-dwelling ones, the Canadian whiptails and others that are really fancy. Some of them get 2 feet long. But they're all in that group of carnivores fish. Carnivores are usually characterized by having relatively big teeth. This is Lepracanthus. And these teeth are actually replaced. If you have one of these in a tank without substrate, you will very quickly find teeth all over the tank, because they shed them and grow new ones. And I used to breed these kinds of things, and they have a nasty habit. If you have a few dozen of those as babies in the tank, they will eat the silicone out of the seeds. And it has to do with the fact in nature, I mean, this thing looks like a pleco. It has a sucker mouth, but it's not really optimized to suck on like the surface, like in Ancestors, for example, or crystallos. And when you see the mouth is sort of, has all these little papillae, those little bubbles, and these are sensory cells. So this is a very sensitive organ, and what it does, together with those little bristles on the thing, it tries to sense out insect larvae. What these guys do is they can extend the teeth quite a bit. Big one. Ooh, ripping stuff. Yeah, you shouldn't let everybody come. Well, I'm just gonna put it here before I break it. But anyway, a big one, a foot and a half long leprechauns can easily extend their teeth by a good inch into a crevice. That's how they go after insect larvae in like cracks of wood or stone. And so they're highly specialized going after insect larvae, worms, little shrimps type stuff. These are molluscivores. This would be the greatest snail eater in the world if it wouldn't get so big. Unfortunately, these things get a good 14, 15 inches. They are pretty messy fish in terms of eating a lot and pooping a lot, so you need a very good filter. They're pretty territorial too. And yeah, if they would stay 2 inches, that would be awesome because they eat literally any snail you can find. They will eat apple snails. They also eat those little burrowing Malaysian trumpet snails. MTS, I think is what people usually call those things. And they're very, very ravenous. They're very good. They simply crack those things like you crack a peanut. So, and the teeth for that are quite big, but instead of being sharp, they're kind of paddle-shaped flat. So they just crush it. And we always forget that even here in our rivers, there's a lot of shrimp and a lot of mussels. And most people keep forgetting that's actually normally the case, unless you pollute the river. And so a lot of fish, especially in the tropics, also live on mussels and shrimp and snails, as long as those animals are present. And the first thing that usually goes in the river, in terms of when we pollute it, are mussels, because they're filter feeders. So anything that is toxic, even in a relatively small amount, gets immediately accumulated in a mussel, and the mussel dies. That's how you usually know that a river is not in good shape when the mussels start disappearing. Then the opportunistic feeders have a lot more teeth and smaller. And what they do, or that's probably why they're so common and easy to keep, a lot of Agolpias, so-called clown plecos, Liposarcus, these are those big common plecos that the trade unfortunately still sells. They're worldwide a very invasive species. They don't really eat anything like other fish or so, but they graze completely, rivers completely blank. In Mexico, they only use swarms. And when they're through, all the greenery that usually grows on rocks is gone. And with it, the cichlids and the swordtails, because most of those live off at outlooks, these things should eat everything. And so then other fish starve. But these fish are very common, and those are the first ones we bred. Because since they accept almost any food and have no problems with it, they tend to be easier to breed, like Christmas, like those are the most common. If you have both sexes and no carnivores, other fish in the tank that eat them up or so, you cannot prevent Christmas from breeding. Once again? A lot, yes. Anyway, so the interesting thing some people may not know, like zebra plecos and other relatives and their babies, they also have a lot of teeth, unlike style fish. Then once they become adults, they lose teeth and turn into a carnivore. So there's in between depending on age. This is a typical grazer. This is actually an adult gold nugget. Those, beautiful little fish. This is how big that thing is. And that's what happens to your plants if you try to put them into the same tank. Other really common grazers are the rubber-nosed plecos. They're still one of my favorites because one of the first plecos I read was a Chiltostoma back in the late 80s, which at that time got an article into the Dots magazine, which was considered the nature of science magazine of the aquarium thing. But there are super specialized grazers that have super fine teeth in these jaws, and they're optimized to live in relatively fast flowing water. There's others too, but in this particular case. Grazers are very prevalent. There's some ancestors that belong in here, the so-called black ones, not the brown ones. They're common Bristol nose and all the breeding forms belong to what we call brown Bristol nose. They're more of the omnivorous type, but the black ones are grazers. Then the Bari ancestors, the gold nuggets, Sudan ancestors, Hemi ancestors, the green and blue phantom plecos coming from Colombia. They're actually very tough to be alive, and I will get to that. So, other things that are common are the royal farlovellas, and of course the little singles guys. These are grazers. So, the food that is really specific for grazers is Aufwuchs. The fancy term is periphyton. And it's literally a mix. And it depends where you are, what river system, etc. But it contains algae, small organisms that can be bacteria, it can be little crustaceans, little insect larvae, mosquito larvae, really tiny ones. And also detritus. Detritus is like organic stuff that is not fully fallen apart. And it also contains almost no calories and a lot of indigestible stuff, because when they graze, they pick up sand, they pick up little wood particles if they graze on wood. And if you want to, figure out what periphyton is, come collecting with us tomorrow, because if you slip on a rock and fall on your butt, you just make friends with periphyton. Because that's tiny stuff that's on the rocks or the wood, that is periphyton, and that's what these fish eat. And then the last of the four groups are the xylivores, or the wood eaters. And these are the Panache and Panoculos, or royal plecos. They have spoon-shaped teeth. And if you look at the tooth structure, it's literally a grasp. And there's a big debate about, do they really digest wood? Or are they just eating decaying wood and eat all the other stuff that comes out of it, or do they digest cellulose? And there's some papers about it arguing both ways. And in my opinion, since nobody has really done the whole genome, the whole, what you call environmental sample sequencing, I don't think they really know what they're looking at, because what they have tried to do is look for cellulose digesting enzymes in the digestive tract. And my argument is, well, you're looking for something specific because that's what you're expecting. But the right way of doing it, you need to look at everything and then look if somehow they can digest it. But that's me. So they come in small shape too, the little panoculos. They look like clown pecocchios or clown plecos. If you see fish like this, sometimes you can't tell them apart from the top, because little tiny pecocchios look exactly the same. So if you wanna take a look, just turn them around. And if you see that V-shaped arrangement of large teeth, it's a Panopoulos. If it has more bar-shaped teeth that are much smaller, you're looking at a Picotia. So what to feed? Well, as always, the problem is in the details. Fish food, at least up to a few years ago, was mostly made from fish meal. And fish meal is one of those omnipresent designations, and according to the law, you can only call it either fish meal, whole fish meal, or white fish meal. There's no other definition. Now, what's the difference between fish meal and whole fish meal? Well, de facto, it's supposed to be the whole fish rest. It's not. Now, you cannot make fish meal out of whole fish. It's not possible. What they do is they squeeze the fish, take the fish oil out, and then the cake that's left over gets ground up as fish meal. So originally, most of the fish were collected to make fish oil, because fish oil has a very, very high return. And most fish meal was essentially ground up and used as fertilizers. And then the aquaculture industry came and said, hey, great, we can feed our salmon with this. That's how this whole thing started. And the fish food industry, or the tropical fish industry, picked up on that, and that's why fish meal became a stellar ingredient. But it's a bit different if you take, say, a whole sardine, squeeze out the oil, take the rest, grind it up, and turn it into fish meal, which is either whole fish meal, white fish meal, or just fish meal, depending on. Or you can do what, for example, the European Union does. It's fish and fish byproducts. Well, what they make a lot of fish meal out is you grow a salmon, and then you take the sides off because smoked salmon gives you a good return, and the rest, being the backbone, the head and the tail, is turned into fish meal. That's still fish and fish byproducts. The only problem is, at that point, you have a huge amount of calcium phosphate in their bones. So if you add that fish meal to fish food, you essentially get a really good fertilizer for your algae culture. And that's why certain fish foods, sometimes even from batch to batch, can cause algae growth in tanks. Because of course fish meal is not a standardized product. It's not that, most producers buy batches from different factories, and fish meal has become a rare commodity, hence the switch to insect meal. Because we pretty much fish out 80% of the fish out of the ocean, so there's almost nothing you can turn into fish meal left. And the vast majority of fish meal is now going in aquaculture industry because salmon and char and other fish give you a good return. Increasingly, tuna is also aquaculture. So there will need more high-end proteins to feed that. Because of course tilapia is frowned upon. We all hate tilapia because it's an invasive fish. The issue is tilapia makes out of a low-quality food a relatively high-quality protein. Now I agree, a good quality salmon tastes better than a good quality tilapia. But we cannot all eat just salmon because there's not enough fish meal on the planet to feed enough salmon and to feed the whole world. Which is not possible. So the general question is always, when they make fish food, are they taking leftovers or are they sticking a wholesome stuff in? The problem with fish meal in fish food for tropical fish is the vast majority of fish we keep are piscivores, meaning in nature they don't eat fish. Now, of course, people will argue, yeah, but my angelfish eats baby guppies. It's like, yeah, that's not this normal food source. Every fish will eat a baby guppy if it gets a chance. That doesn't mean he or she is a piscivore or a fish eater. when you look at Planet Catfish, there's, I don't know, 45 families now. And of those, only 5 or 6 contain fish-eating fish. Bivalves and some of the other bigger ones.
Planet Catfish is a website, by the way, so that you remember.
Yeah, I mean, Planet Catfish, which is run by my friend Jules Signal in Scotland, is probably the single most well-established fish information site of any kind. They work very closely with a lot of scientists, and I've known Jules for many, many years, and I'm actually going to Edinburgh in 8 weeks to hang out with him for 10 days in the Scottish Highlands. So there's no catfish there, but we'll still gonna have fun. So, I've always sort of thought, well, if we want to feed our fish properly, we should have food that contains mostly invertebrate proteins, meaning snails, shrimp, insects, the like, stuff without vertebrates, right? Problem is, that literally did not exist. So Alan, Ripashi, and I initially developed what at that point was marketed as Fruit Loops, which was my invention, and the idea that I had was I wanted a food for rainforest fish. And as you know, the water level goes up and down in the rainforest areas, not in all, but in some. And what usually happens is the fish breed in that time when the water level goes up and water sweeps into the forest. And at that point, the fish eat literally, I mean, spiders, little mammals, fruit, seeds, nuts, plants of all kinds. And I said, the cool thing to have would be fish food that contains all that. And because Rinpoche had the opportunity to essentially take single ingredients and add it to the jelly mix, that is the base of all this reptile and fish foods, we started playing with different things. So the Fruit Loops contain fruit, wood, look at the leguminosus, because that's a very common plant species in the tropics. It contained nuts, it contained seeds, and so we first developed that. Then we did the bottom scratcher, where the idea was, let's get a food that has algae plus insect stuff. And both these foods were possible because black soldier fly larvae meal had been developed in Ohio and like that. And ground pie was a food that was mostly invertivore food, so most of the ingredients are inverts like shrimp and insects. Today, what used to be Fruit Loops right here is now modernized as Igapo. Igapo is the Florida Forest Explorer. And we changed the recipe a little bit. I was very proud of what we did. And Alan said that after we had the formula fully developed, I was like, well, there's no way I can sell this because ingredients are way too expensive. So we switched out a few things. We took the papaya out, which, you know, it's not that somebody makes dried papaya that is made for animals. There's only one way. Alan is absolutely adamant there is no Chinese ingredients in my fish foods, because if I order a pallet of ingredients from China, the only way I can find out what's in it is having it shipped to the US and then send it to the lab and then tell me halfway to start. At that point, you already spent all the money. So he's like, no. And that's, for example, something we have never found a source to replace snails, because there is nobody making snail meal other than the Chinese companies that make it from those big land snails. yeah, hot snails. And he's like, there's no way I'm putting this in my fish food because I cannot guarantee constant quality. But we figured out if we take cephalopods, i.e. Squid. Squid and snails are very closely related, and if you look at the fatty acid and amino acid profile, meaning how many of the different types they have in it, they're very, very close. So squid meal was the ingredient that made up for snails. So this is what EGOT bowl contains: krill meal, insect meal, mussel, and squid. And then a whole bunch of other things. So this is, so we have banana powder in it, mango powder, pea flour, mulberry fruit, dandelion, seaweed, almond, and coconut make up the nuts. Flax makes up the seeds, and alfalfa meal makes up the leguminoses. We looked at what's out there that you can use as an ingredient that is approved. Because that's the other thing, it's not just sourcing it, it has to be in that 1,500-page menu of approved ingredients. If you put something in that's not approved and somebody goes after you, it can be quite costly. So, one thing that, assuming you're having, you identify the fish, you know what they're supposed to eat, and you get the food according to what they prefer. Some people are, and I know that from way back, almost 40 years ago now, in the pet store, you tell people, hey, this is a great food for your fish, and they say about this can is a barb on top, and they have a ciglet at home, and they're like, this is barb food, my ciglet won't eat the barb. So, let's see, do I need to say something else here? Well, off-label use is something that's used in the drug industry constantly. For example, certain drugs are approved for one thing, but they found out in the meantime, so much by accident, that they also work on other diseases. But the FDA hasn't officially approved it for that purpose, for the simple reason, usually you need to spend a lot of money running a trial before something can be given to humans. But then it's sometimes done as an off-label use. One of the weirdest things that is used in cancer, for example, is mustard gas. People who know history, mustard gas is a chemical weapon of World War I. And yeah, it is used in about 8,000 cases of cancer a year in the US. It does work to treat certain things. So, well, this is usually a little bit of a problem. Just because the label says my fish should eat it does not necessarily mean so, and the other way around either. So, the problem with hungry fish is they will eat almost anything. So why worry? I mean, if they eat everything, I could just use home meal. That's about as cheap as it gets, especially if you get it, in bulk bags at Costco or something. And that's something that you see a lot, especially down in Florida on the tropical fish farms. They use trout chop. Now, when you're breeding fish, you try to condition fish. You try to put a lot of protein in it so they make nice eggs or fertile, etc. That might be good. The disadvantage, especially if you go to certain fish dealers, you see tetras and bars that are literally twice the size they should be. I mean, they're just humongously big. And whenever somebody comes with like a black surf tetra that is like 2.5 inches long and about yay big and looks like a silver dollar, well, they don't get that big in nature. But if you feed them a chow chow, you can make them very big. And that's what they do. Survey tetras are another one you find. Cristella tetras, all that sort of cheap stuff, bread and butter, things that PetSmart and Tecmo sells for $1.99 and so on. You sometimes get humongous big fish. Years ago, I got some wild giant danios from Sri Lanka, which I caught as little babies out of a whole group of Rasboras that were imported from Sri Lanka, that's like 20 or 30. And at that time, I didn't even know what it is, just a little symphony in there. Took them home, grew them up, like, these are giant danios. Well, they're nothing like the giant danios you find. They never grew bigger than about 2.5 inch. And they're orange in the belly and totally brilliant blue all over the body. I think I have a picture on the computer, I can search for it afterwards. But I'm like, now I understand why people used to like giant danios, because the original fish actually looks great. But the stuff you find in the store today doesn't. It's a gray fish, gray silvery fish that's about 4.5 inches big. Usually misses some fins or some other deformities because they're so cheap, nobody sorts them, they just make mass production. So, not a good thing. Aquaculture feed, well, the whole idea is to get fish fat quick. So, your aquarium fish shouldn't get fat or grow that quick. If you overdrive the fish, you usually pay for it in fecundity at the end. They have less babies, or you get other problems. Another issue with when I see people buy trout chow, you get a big bag of Purina 00 trout chow. That's 30 or 40 pounds. First of all, even for a fish room at 90 bags on mine, that would last forever. And on top of that stuff is moist and has only a shelf life of 3 or 4 months at decent temperature. If it's a little warmer like in the fish room, it's gone in like a month or two. It starts to stay rancid. And as soon as most fish rooms will last 3-4 years over the day.
You ever see when they feed the trout, it's by the shovelful, so they go through it, but yeah.
Of course, yeah. And the same is true for a Florida fish farm too. But for the average fish room, unless, say, as a club, you buy a bag and say, hey, use this as a conditioning food if you want to breed certain fish, fine. As long as you split up the large quantity among people, or you stick it in the freezer. But if you just keep it at room temperature, or worse in the fish room, it will go south. So the quick at that one, I'm like, okay, so if you spend $100 in a bag for 40 pounds, I understand it's only $250 a pound. But if you throw away 30 pounds, the other 10 pounds certainly cost $100 that you used. So you may as well buy your raw fish food for $10 a pound. Yeah. But this is a free country. I always say you can do whatever you like. But I'm telling you, go with the good stuff. Now, I talked about off-label use. One thing, and I'm still trying to talk my friends at Sarah into put a different label on this thing. This is a fish food. It's sold as sturgeon food in Europe and here. But it was originally developed for stingrays. And a company that produces lots of stingrays in Germany, South American freshwater stingrays, eventually decided not to essentially market it themselves. So Sarah was looking for an alternative use for the formula, and sturgeons are very, very popular in ponds in Europe. You go anywhere, you go literally in any fish store in Europe and you find little sterlets, which are a small 2-foot sturgeon variant, but you can find big ones too. There's at least 5 or 6 different sturgeon species available as fingerlings, because they're all produced for aquaculture to make caviar. I mean, the harvest of the Iranians and Russians on the Black Sea is pretty much non-existent compared to what is now done in aquaculture. There's a few years back, I was back in Switzerland, and up high in the mountains, near a big tunnel that goes all the way to Italy, one of the big railway tunnels, there's a big farm that produces sturgeon. And the reason why they can do that is the water comes at 72 degrees out of the granite from the tunnel, from the drainage system. Because the granite around the tunnel has so much uranium in it, the natural decay of uranium is enough that it warms the water up to 72 degrees. It's not radioactive at all, but the natural decay of uranium in the granite is enough to heat the water to 72 degrees. So they're producing caviar with nuclear energy, essentially. So that's pretty cool. But here in the US, there's probably now dozens of caviar farms. I know several in the Carolinas. Okay. Yeah, Florida has a big problem. It's too warm for sturgeon.
What's too warm? The spring pattern come on, some of them 62 degrees.
Well, if you keep running the water, yes. I mean, the problem in northern Florida, the problem is it can get cold in the winter time. That's why they always get fish meals in the ponds. And in southern Florida, it's too warm. Like the big farms around Homestead, they can only work in the summer because they pump water all day long into the vats, so the temperature doesn't go above 90 because otherwise you cook. I mean, some Tanganyikans will survive that, but a lot of other fish don't like it that warm. Right, but the water is thrown are rock hard. I mean, it's all coral rock, so the water is extremely hard. So I've told them many times, put like a big carnivore label type thing on this thing. You can sell tons of this in the US because there's so many people with monster fish. And I sell it a lot to people who have quarries and carnivores like those, because it's a wafer, so it doesn't fall apart very quick. And $39 for a 3.8 liter bucket. It's very inexpensive compared to the other chips that they sell at roughly $30 per liter. So this thing literally is like a third of the price. It only comes in one size.
It's like $12 for a 4-ounce pack. Some of them.
Yeah, I mean the Viper chips and the one name was that. Yeah.
Here, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to catch up on somebody. Because we got still stuff still in the auction, and some people can stay afterwards and talk to Stephan.
Well, I think I'm pretty close to the end.
Okay.
Was that a hint?
Yes. Well, it's just that they don't people leave before we get to the sales.
Well, that would be really bad. Really wouldn't. So, this is another sort of weird thing. They make this in buckets. I just brought Pat a bucket of this. And they make small containers, but the 1 liter can they only make with a marine label. That's why. So all flavor use. They make a great food, unfortunately only in tiny cans. It's a vegetable granule, small, ideal for like certain bark types. If you label it as coffee brand, people might buy it for their life beers, but not necessarily thinking about other things. I have a bunch of these in the car. Koi Nature, it's a silkworm pupae, freeze-dried. Ideal food for all of big fish. They sell it as a koi treat, of course, koi love that stuff. But there's lots of big fish eating from the surface that actually go bananas, and the things are a good inch big. This is one of my staple granules that I use in the fish room, biscuits granules. And another good food for all the flaccos is the granule green, which is a small extruded pellet developed mostly for Tanganyikan and Malawi cichlids. But it goes really well with lots of more vegetarian flaccos. So the thing is always figure out in what category your fish is. And it's not just flaccos, anything. Like Tropheus people who have had those know that if you feed them their own flake or their own pellet, they blow those instantaneously. I mean, the saying goes around. Huh?
A lot of the replace.
Right, yeah, if you just put the wrong can next to the tank, they blow. So, it's really important, and that's how we killed lots of flaccos initially. We thought, oh, we need to pump them full of like algae, so we tried to feed zebra flaccos with algae. That didn't go so well. They didn't necessarily blow, but they didn't do so well.
Like with meteors.
Yeah, yeah. So, other things, like Omega makes marine pellets and marine flakes, and people are like, oh, I can't feed my fish marine food. Well, the usual difference is they contain 2 extra additives that you don't usually put in freshwater stuff because the marine fish can't synthesize that. So it has to be added to the fish food, but it's not harmful for the freshwater fish at all. But what they have is garlic, which a lot of other freshwater flakes like. So it's actually quite a good food. The unfortunate thing is Omega was acquired by Spectrum. Spectrum is one of those super large companies, and knowing sort of through the back channels, it's not going to end well for Omega, I think, in the end. Because we have seen this many times now when big companies buy up smaller family-owned companies, it doesn't go so well in the long run. But they made for years that veggie round based on kelp. There's almost nobody else who makes kelp, almost purely kelp-based food. Again, different stuff. And I'm done.
Okay, what is some of the ingredients, some of these cans over here? You know,
You want to like,
some of them have a list of ingredients that's a half mile long, and other ones have like 8 or 10 ingredients, it seems like.
Yes. And then you have some companies that just